Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. We have a fantastic guest joining us for Cafe Con Luis this morning, Salman Ansari. Welcome. I hope you're doing well. Good morning.
Thanks so much. Good morning, you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. It's one of these very special episodes in the sense that I came across an article of yours that went, let's just call it viral, and I was very validated by many of the things that it said, and I saw how many people reacted positively to it, and I kind of out of the blue reached out on one of those Twitter whims where you said, "Hey, my DMs are open." And I DM'd you, and you kind of were open to the idea of having this chat, and here we are. So thank you for being open-minded and being willing to jump on and just have this chat. I'd just like to briefly introduce myself. I am a director of marketing at Enable. I've been here almost a year. I've had previous careers in IT. I've been an MSP owner for 15 years. I've been a professional musician for 25. So in many ways, the topic today is very relevant to how I feel about life and careers and stuff like that. And that's part of what we're going to explore. And we've got our wonderful guest Salman, who has also been a number of things over the last few years. And so I'm not sure if there's anything you'd like to add. If there's one that is a specific highlight of the list here, Salman, but I'll let you say hello.
No, thank you. I mean, they all kind of contribute to the whole that is me, and so I try not to give anyone too much strength in my identity. But I've really enjoyed um, kind of this switch between working, writing, coding, being an engineer, and then sort of sharing that. And the writing and teaching kind of comes into that, which is why I really enjoy conversations like this. And I've been trying to connect with more folks who kind of explore diverse pursuits. So I'm excited to chat with everyone today. I also just want to say I'd love to hear questions and sort of thoughts and struggles from folks who are on the call today. Yeah, just excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna just let us be on video primarily, and I'll just bring a thank you slide with your blog article or your blog address later on, or we'll drop it in the chat as well. So definitely, folks, your questions and chat is welcome because I think that's exactly what we want to get out of today is sort of an interesting conversation. So, Salman, one of the things I posed in the agenda, so to speak, for this conversation was this idea of, how experiences in different careers can help people solve problems in different and innovative ways. And I think in IT, one of the things that's sort of interesting is that starting a business of IT, there's no school for that. You can go to get trained as a technical engineer, networking engineer, server engineer. You can take courses for that kind of stuff, but the business of IT is not something that there's a school for. And so sometimes people come into IT and they've been a business owner of something else, or they've been just in another career. Myself, in my case, I have had a music business where I had literally a booth at wedding fairs where I would play in my booth to sell people my performances at weddings. And I've helped my wife start a candy shop, a brick and mortar retail shop. And so it's interesting, people coming into IT have all these varied backgrounds. And so I'm curious to just chat with you a little bit about this idea of like problem solving, because I'm sure as an engineer, which you are, there's a lot of that goes into engineering. And I'm curious how you've applied sort of previous careers to problem solving in your current one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's sort of a few elements to this, and I guess you could call it kind of a progression of how you approach problems. So that, I think the first thing I realized was that I would show up after I had explored a few different, let's call them like career roles. So I started out my career as an engineer, and then I kind of moved into management, and then, later I was playing a founder role, and then actually kind of went back to being an engineer for a while because I really missed that. And now I'm kind of doing a mix. And one of the things I noticed was there were these sort of hidden lessons that existed within a given role. So if you're a manager and you talk to other managers, everyone sort of knows that, when there's a particular kind of organizational problem, you kind of have to approach it this way. And it's sort of like domain knowledge, you might call it. And then the same thing works if you cut it across industries. So I worked in sort of a marketing industry when I first started, and then went into healthcare industry. And I noticed again, there were these like sort of secrets that everyone knew in healthcare industry. If you're working in there, there's all these sort of approaches, and but they don't really come out. Like if you're in the healthcare world, you know this stuff, but when you leave, no one else has an understanding of that. And I thought that was interesting because a lot of times, the way that we can model these problems is pretty universal. Healthcare is an interesting place. So a lot of situations in healthcare, you've probably run into this as a human being who participates in any kind of healthcare industry. We run into frustrations with the technology that's used, the experience that we run into. And one of the things I noticed is like the expectations were pretty low. Like, okay, this is just how it is. This is how these systems work. This isn't like a place where, in the past, Salman, you built fun experiences, user experiences and stuff like that. That's great, Salman, but this is healthcare. Like this is where
Yeah,
important
follow
healthcare things
the
happen.
guidelines. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was like, I don't know. I feel like people want good experiences. I feel like that is just a general truth. So I kind of went and conducted an experiment. So I was a co-founder and CTO of this healthcare startup that was focused on sleep. It was called Rested. And we basically needed people to sign on and do a whole bunch of checklists. Like imagine when you go to the doctor's office and they give you this clipboard and you've got to sit there and fill it out. And everyone hates it. Everyone hates that clipboard. It takes so long. You're like, why do I have to do this? I already filled other stuff out. This is annoying. And I'm like, can I make this fun? Is it possible to actually make this fun? So I built I was, when I say CTO, at that time it was just me and my co-founder. So, it's like CTO, but the team grew later. But at that point, I was building a
Yeah.
lot of the software. So I got to make some of these decisions. And I built this sort of fun survey experience where you get a question and some options and you can tap one and it kind of does some bounciness and there's a lot of like sort of playfulness with it. And when you finish it, it gives you a little, hey, congratulations, and you kind of like, oh, this is kind of fun. And you know, we basically did a bunch of data analysis, and more than 80% of people completed the whole thing, which is wild. If you look at most completion rates for onboarding things like that, they're in the 30s and 40% rate typically. In fact, we used to get messages. This was a really interesting message I got from someone who was like, "Hey, I finished the onboarding. Are there any others? I would like to complete them." Like they wanted more clipboards to fill out. And so that actually taught me that, hey, there's this principle that worked well in another domain, right? And people are telling me that it shouldn't work here, that this is not the place, that this is a place for serious medical business. Um, but I'm going to test that theory, and then you kind of apply it, and no one else is really trying that approach because they haven't been building animations and stuff like that. This kind of comes in multiple parts because animations are just sort of a side passion that I've always had since I was a kid. And so, again, this is another thing you'll see when building software. People are like, animations are just sort of fluff. They're sort of they're not really critical and things like that. But I kind of look at it as like, hey, if we can make things fun and playful, I think that touches the human side of it. And one of the things I realized was people appreciate that you thought about it and you went the extra mile to do those things because they know that a human did that. It's not even the actual experience, it's the fact that you care. So what can we go and pull from our other domains, our other passions, and sort of like incorporate in that someone else in that space who hasn't had those experiences or doesn't have those passions would not have done, is kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think sometimes we do it just unconsciously or subconsciously. There's obviously some way that we did something in another career that we just haven't brought to the surface to try and understand it or put specific labels or words on it, and we just do some of those things natively because
Yeah.
that's how it was done over there, or maybe there was a process that was sort of became a habit or something, and then all of a sudden you find that there's some abstraction of that process that you can apply to this other thing. And IT is very interesting in that sense because I find that some of the best IT people just have this interesting sort of 180-degree view of looking at problems, and they can see this one issue, but also immediately like understand everything from the user's behavior to what the computer might be doing to obviously experience that tells them, oh well, when you click the button this way it does this, or there's many of those things that play a role as well. Obviously experience is not to be underrated there.
Sure,
um,
yeah.
to obviously even the user's state, how they're thinking, and some of the predictable people behaviors in the process of providing IT. And then I see other people really struggle through the process of like help doing IT support because they're very one track minded, in the sense of like, okay, well, they see that this is a problem and all they're thinking is about the interface, but they're not sort of bringing in all this other areas of view into that problem solving thing. And so this is where I think, again, having been in different industries suddenly opens your mind up to keeping so many different things in mind
Yeah.
as part of that process. So very fascinating.
Yeah, and what I would add is it's about kind of your past, but it's also about your future. So, I'll give a quick story. The first internship I ever did, it was actually during kind of just after well, I mean, there were several, but there was sort of a tech crash, and it was very difficult to find any internship. And I struggled a lot to find an internship, and I ended up finding one at it was kind of like a corn canola sort of DNA research plant. It was literally like near an agricultural farm and stuff like that. And I came on to the IT team actually. That was my first ever role. Um, and my task was pretty simple. I had to like swap out the tape backup drives, and maybe do a couple other things. And I didn't have that much else going on. There was a head of IT who kind of did most everything. And at first I kind of was pretty frustrated. Was just sort of bored and didn't really know what to do. But I was very curious. Like I had never been in a plant like this. It was an engineering plant. There was huge teams of scientists and engineers doing all kinds of interesting things. And so I kind of like just sort of started wandering
Hmm.
around and observing people. And I eventually met the head of purchasing, and he was kind of responsible for ordering all the equipment and test tubes and all these kinds of things. And the way that he went about his job was, he would literally take a sheet of paper, pass it around the entire building. People would write down what they wanted, and then he would order them, and he would put them in a binder, and then the binder would get filed. And if you looked at his office, it was just a wall of binders. And I remember thinking, like, I mean, this was a while back, but I still felt like, yeah, maybe there's something here. It's definitely not my job, but I feel like this could be better. So I basically asked permission from my boss to try and work on this. And they were kind of like, I mean, what are you going to do about it? Sure, do whatever you want. And I actually started to learn how to, that was my first web app sort of research. And I basically built this internal web app by, I went and talked to some of the scientists team, and I talked to some of the engineering team, like what's annoying about ordering and things like that. So it would just be a really simple one where they could click a drop down order, and it ended up shaving off like 2 months of the purchasing end of year reporting time and stuff like that. And a lot of the team loved it. So I think one of the lessons that I took from that was, when you're working in IT, you actually have access to a sort of cross cut of so many different departments, right? It just like sitting right where you are today. And you're not always going to get the initiative to be given this task of like, hey, go and solve problems that exist across all of these. But if you let your curiosity play a little bit, it can lead you to learn about some of those. And so that's what I mean by the future is like, it's not just about other roles you've had in the past, but can you let your curiosity actually drive you to learn about either other departments at your company or other industries, and help you come up with ways that you can sort of go beyond the scope of what you're doing today. A
Sure.
lot of it is just about giving yourself permission to do that. Um,
Yeah, interesting. I think IT has so many parallels to things like that, and obviously, in this case, it was IT related in your case. But the process of developing a web app that solves an IT problem, you could argue, or many IT people would argue, that that's not an IT problem to solve necessarily. My problem, my my focus is on other things. But it's interesting to me, something I've been exploring with some of the conversations I've had recently is this idea of like the difference between being great at IT and being great at helping people with IT, sort of the human
Right,
element of
right.
this. And I wonder like how much our ability to be people minded or people focused in that process is influenced by previous careers or previous things where we've actually interacted with people heavily. And I do see a lot of this because in IT, I think there's this ugly underbelly of like how IT people talk about their end users when their end users are not there. And I think maybe this is just one of those things that is just part of like how we deal with the negativity of like everything. Every interaction is about a problem. I think that in itself is something that's interesting thing to that people don't see coming. They're blindsided a little bit by the fact that
Yeah,
you know what? I love technology, but all of a sudden that turns into dealing with people's problems day in, day out, all the time. And obviously, in your case with a web app, you're actually, solving a problem where you're helping people be happy in a structured, sort of process-driven way. But IT is just such this bag of tricks and bag of unexpected things that happens. And so, I'm
yeah.
curious just about this people aspect of things.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And like, it's interesting because I mean, this was maybe in like, I'll date myself here, but this was like back in the mid 2000s when I was doing this. And to be honest, back then there wasn't really that much formality between like, the web app developers and IT. It was kind of like you're just sort of solving problems using technology. And so I didn't even know that it was a web app. It was literally just like a thing that used electricity and the internet in order to help someone because they were really
It's worse.
frustrated.
It's worse today because if it plugs into a wall, it's IT's problem. So yeah, that nothing has
um,
changed.
yeah, I mean, I think it's worth noting that the role of IT has evolved and that, one of the challenges has always been sort of the attitude and how people look at it and that impacts the interactions that they have, which as you said, often start with problems, which means they often start with frustrations. So I have to just sort of comment and just say, one has to acknowledge that that's a reality that makes it very difficult. On the other hand, now that I reflect on it, speaking to your point about the people aspect, I think this is a really interesting thing to talk about. So one of the things that I really miss, and the reason why I still tell this story about this experience I had early in the career is because I mean, it was just so rewarding because I was able to build something and then I would walk over and show someone or see how they're using it and I could see their struggle or their happiness and the feedback loop was incredible. One of the things we share is that we both have been DJs and what I love about being a DJ is you get immediate feedback. You're playing a song and you can tell right away by the tone and the voice and stuff like that. And that is extremely rare. So, one of the contrasts here is that when you're working in IT, your customers are typically this team that exists and these humans right around you. And so you can get
Mm.
that personal interaction. Whereas, a lot of the typical web app development that is done, this customer is this sort of fictitious entity, and you have some analytics about them, and you kind of have some idea of whether but you never really get that feedback loop, and you feel much more disconnected. And I remember feeling like, wow, it's kind of scary that there's people here. If I screw something up, they'll be really angry at me, and they're right there. But on the other hand, some of them became really good friends, and I was reveling in this process of being able to literally make something with my hands, give it, and then see how they play with it and watch and kind of learn that way. So I think, it's sort of a double-sided sort of problem, or like there's an opportunity on the other side of the problem, which is that when you do serve, when your customers are people who are around you, it can be really difficult, but it can also be an opportunity to really work in a high return feedback loop, which is a rare thing and it can be a really rewarding experience too.
Yeah, well, IT is ironic that way in that, you can help people and still like they'll complain that
Of
you
course.
help them, but they have to be away from their computer for 5 minutes while you fix the problem. Like, why did I have to be away from my computer for 5 minutes?
Right.
And it's because, people's urgencies and people's deadlines and things like this, it's really hard for people to step out of their context to sort of understand it. there's things like that that just need to happen. But so yeah, IT is ironic, and I think the part that is interesting about IT is that nothing prepares us for dealing with those types of people problems, I guess is the best
Mm.
way I can describe it. So it's one of those things you learn. It's trial by fire. You learn on the job how to work with people, and you have to build a little bit of that thick skin. And this starts to get to a little bit of the core of like why people start to seek out other things to do. And I see this happening a lot in IT, Facebook groups and stuff like that. Every couple weeks, somebody's like, "Hey, so what is everybody doing to disconnect?" Or what is everybody doing? What is your side gig? Almost like it's expected that you have a side gig when you're in IT, although not as common as when you're a musician. When you say you're a musician, and the next question that people ask you is, "So what's your day job?" So, in
Yep.
ways, there are some industries that I think are stereotyped into being multi functional industries. IT is not generally one, but I find people have to find other things to do in order to disconnect and really try to change their mental context and relax. And you've talked about um, things like how do you disconnect, how do you create space, you like to go on walks and stuff like that to clear the
Yep.
mind. And so maybe jump into that topic a little
Yeah.
bit of yeah.
Yeah. I think, you know, I think the urge and the desire to quote disconnect is fairly common, I think, across a number of different industries. I see it in sort of the software development industry, the web app industry. We see it in IT, and I've always kind of been curious about that. And there's a lot of branches here, so I'll touch on a few, and you tell me which branch we want to go into. But I think the first thing is that people seek certain things from their work, um, and and those come through expectations that have been set throughout their lives about what they should expect from work. One of the most challenging things that we expect from our work is meaning, and there's a whole bunch of stuff to unwrap there. Is that we sort of expect work to give us, provide us with meaning, and to be the thing that we're doing in our lives that's meaning, and that places a lot of pressure on it. And so when it doesn't fulfill that purpose, we seek it from other places, and we seek to supplement it. The other thing I would say, at least in my case, when I have felt like I want something else or I want something more, it's usually when I haven't been able to exercise a sufficient amount of creativity within my day job, if you will, right? And this happens in every job. But if I'm an engineer and I'm sort of just being given instructions and I have to sort of follow this, there's not much room for me to be creative here. And so the creativity in me feels this urge to come out. And that's where a lot of the side passions end up being, like me DJing and you DJing, or me doing improv, or whatever it is, because we are naturally creative. We want to try different things. We want to experiment. And so a lot of times it has less to do with the actual industry, and more to do with that specific role you have there and the level of freedom that you're getting to kind of experiment in different ways. Um, I think that when you are able to incorporate both, when you have a position that allows you to learn, allows you to be creative, I generally find that people are not looking for additional creative side projects. They're kind of burned out on creativity, if you will. I feel like you only have a limited amount of creative energy. One of the things I've noticed in the recently, so right now I work part-time with a startup, and then the rest of the time I'm doing creative projects. So I'm writing, I'm drawing, I'm doing all these kinds of things. And I'm doing more creative work than I've ever done before. And so some things that I used to be creative about, I don't have the energy to be creative anymore. Cooking is one of them. I actually used to really enjoy thinking sort of critically about the ingredients and preparing and stuff like that. And now I'm just like, I need to use that energy for writing and drawing. So I think creativity is a really important piece. I think that within IT specifically, I know that you were saying people feel almost this pressure, to be doing something else, and to be expanding into some other area. I think we talked about two things, meaning and creativity. I think a third thing to consider here is that there is a natural underpinning of, I guess you could frame it as fear. We all in the technology field have this constant running fear that we are about to be deprecated, right? Like that we are going to be left behind. Somebody else learned some other technology, and I'm going to be left behind. And this is across all technology work. And so part of that expectation comes from, what are you doing to make sure you're ahead on the next thing? Because usually, the company, the business that you're at, it's a business, so it's got to operate. It doesn't have the luxury to just be running technology experiments with all new stuff all the time. So it's like, okay, well, put in your full energy here, but then also go home and study this completely new, totally off the
Yeah.
chart, domain, and become an expert in it at night, and build a side project, and um, make it open source, or what have you. And so part of those questions are being asked out of, oh, what are other people doing so I can do them? And the irony is that when you ask that question, then the other person who's listening to the question then feels peer pressure, and they're like, oh, should I be doing something? Oh God, okay. Well, I don't know. I guess I'm doing this. And then you tell them you're doing that, and they're like, oh wow, they're actually doing something, and then they start doing it. And so we basically create this sort of peer pressure driven, which started, sort of harmlessly out of curiosity. Instead of coming from a place of genuine curiosity, comes from a place of sort of insecurity, feeling like we have to be touching on those.
Yeah, interesting. I think the insecurity is certainly, because IT sometimes people, just because they were good with tech, they got handed the job, and in many cases, and that's sort of the beginning of a career. And there's not necessarily been an opportunity to frame, how you do your work, or how you frame
Yeah.
troubleshooting, or how you go about doing all these things. You just have this natural exposure to technology, and you're able to fix things and or solve problems, and all of a sudden, hey, great, you can take care of the IT going forward. And sometimes those things are counterproductive, because um, what is great for somebody as a hobby or something that they are able to do is not necessarily
Mm,
the thing that they could potentially focus all of their entirety of their workday on.
yeah.
And so I've been recently listening to Patrick Lencioni, who is the author of Five Dysfunctions of a Team. He also has a number of other books. One of the things he recently started doing is this framework called the Six Working Geniuses. And the Six Working Geniuses is super interesting, because one of the things he does is he explores, and it's a very simple framework, but so it's like a Breyer's or Myers Briggs or a
Uh-huh.
DISC profile, that kind of stuff. But it's a
Okay.
very short questionnaire, and just gives you a sense of, like, you like to be sort of a long-term thinker, or you're a creative thinker, or you're I forget the exact six types, but
Right.
I immediately was able to label myself with one of the types. And one of the things that's interesting that it does for you is it tells you the things you're not. And so this
Mhm.
is one aspect that I feel that people take too long to realize when they are not going to be good at something. They feel like they should be able to do this, and there's
Yeah.
this interesting social pressure to, like, perform in something that they were good at, but that they realize they're not necessarily enjoying or being fulfilled at doing that one thing. And I find
Yeah.
this happens a lot in IT. Just because you're good with tech doesn't mean you're going to be fulfilled or great at doing this for extended periods of time. This is where this interesting sort of having to balance out life, or having to find other things to do, comes into play. But I think this is true of also many other
Yeah.
jobs and roles. And this is why some of the data that you put on your article, like 80% of people in jobs are unhappy, and
Yeah.
it's because nobody has stopped to think, am I actually fulfilled with this, and do I have
Right.
permission to explore other things?
Yeah. So I think so that's really interesting. And I think the thing to jump into here is, there's multiple dimensions that one needs to take into account to make a decision about whether this is a thing I should explore. And so being good at something is one of those things, right? But you mentioned feeling fulfilled, and that assumes that if I just do the things that I'm good at, I'll be good to go. This is kind of the common perception, is that if I'm good at this, I should focus on that, and if I'm bad at that, I should not worry about that. The other dimension to it that I think about a lot is, do I enjoy it? Do I get energy from the thing? Because there are certain things that I am good at that I used to get energy from and I don't anymore.
Mm.
Or there are certain things that I'm really good at that I just never got energy from. But I'm just very good at them. And so I think the difficulty there, and this comes from a scarcity mindset, I think, as an immigrant, like my parents kind of probably helped contribute to this thinking a little bit, but like we're kind of taught like, if you have an opportunity, like if you're blessed, if you're lucky and gifted in a certain thing, don't waste that. Like don't throw it away. Like take good advantage of it. So we feel sort of compelled to do that. So in my case, like I was a founder and it went fairly well, but it was also extremely energy intensive. And I'm not sure when, if I'll do it again. I probably might, but there's every day that I don't, I feel this like compulsion of like, you should have been doing that right now, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think when people are thinking about these questions, they get inputs from folks. Actually, this is something I was reading about yesterday. One of the most dangerous things is that people will primarily derive their inputs around what they do from other people that they work with, right? So you might ask your manager, you might ask your peers, hey, you guys tell me, what are the things that you think I should focus more on? And this is a dangerous game to play because you might have someone who is very, very intuitive, empathetic, and understands like, okay, well, I notice that you're actually, really good at this, but I also notice you don't enjoy it that much, and so on and so. It's unlikely that happen, and more likely that they will tell you the things that you're good at, based on what they've seen you do, and based on
Irrespective
what
of
works.
whether you like it or not. Yeah.
Exactly, because here's the thing, it's actually really hard to know that, right? And so this is where it's important to build self-awareness. So I would say that of all of the tools in my tool belt of navigating many different pursuits, if not the most important, one of the most important is being able to observe myself. And so, I do a lot of practices around this. So I journal almost every day. I meditate, or I try and think about, I do some planning and reflection. And it's because I'm human, and I'm fickle, and I change my mood, and I change all these things. So I have to pay close attention and be like, I thought I liked this, but I just wrote down apparently that every time I'm doing it, I'm like in a crabby mood. I don't like it. I don't feel energized. I can't get myself. And it's like, listen, Salman, the data is saying that you don't like this. You thought you do. And so it's really important for us to be able to observe ourselves and see the truth. And that's what, and the reason why I say this is hard is because just because you listen to the voices in your head doesn't mean you'll get the truth, because our thoughts are the great master of delusion. Like we can delude ourselves into almost anything,
We
right?
can
And
rid
it's
ourselves
actually
of anything, yeah. And the journal is interesting because it's like it's the empirical data that lets you prove otherwise. And if you don't have it, you're just going to convince yourself of whatever the current need is, and which is not necessarily, it's
absolutely.
counterproductive. Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things I've been studying more is understanding sort of the ego, which is, there's different frames for it, but
None of that in IT, by the way.
yeah. The ego has been known as like, oh, it's this when someone is kind of arrogant and stuff like that, they have an ego. And it's a little bit more complex, right? Like we're all of us have a construct in ourselves, which we call ego with a capital E. And that plays a role. It basically tries to protect us from harm, which is sort of an evolutionary thing that we have, but it's not really necessary because we're not really facing life-threatening risks all the time anymore, but it's still there. Um, and so a lot of times, my ego will tell me things of like, hey, I think we need to be doing some of this because there's a risk that tomorrow you're going to be completely wiped out and useless and no one will care. And I'll be like, okay, that seems kind of extreme. Or on the other side, it'll be overly positive, like, oh, this is an amazing idea. You should invest all our energy into this. Let's go, go, go. And I'm like, that's interesting. Your story kind of changed from yesterday, and so I'll try and have these sort of conversations with myself where I'll observe with a lightness, with some lightness and some humor, because otherwise you can get caught up in it. But yeah, going back to what you were saying, I think we need to become as thorough, as sort of data driven, as intelligent and analytical about ourselves as we are, with anything else. If it comes to a product and software, each of us will be like, oh, well, are you using this system? Are you using that framework? Your data isn't quite blah, blah, blah. We're so sophisticated there. But, when it comes to ourselves, we don't always have that same level of sophistication. So it's really important to sort of listen to that. And for me, it's like a lifeline. That's how I know what to pick from between, this long, long list of different things that I get excited about and want to do.
Yeah. So, in your blog post, and for anybody that's just jumping in, where the basis of this conversation is Salman's blog post called the Polymath Playbook, and we'll put a link to it in the chat. Terry, by the way, the issue is I don't think I'm an organizer, so I can't send a chat to everybody. So if you make me an organizer, that'll allow me to send a message to everybody. And so one of the things you talk about is the things that were sort of the drivers of the, I guess, the social context.
Yeah.
And so over the weekend on Saturday, I remember I got clickbaited into clicking to watching this YouTube video. And it was Stephanie Rule, who was an investment banker for 15 years and then became an MSNBC news anchor.
Okay.
So clearly a polymath in a way, a long time in a career and then switched careers. And then she was interviewing Professor Scott Galloway, who's a professor at NYU, and he wrote a book called the Algebra of Happiness. They're talking about happiness and sort of this interesting curve that happens, as a child and in your teens, you're fairly happy, but with the exception that today teens have a lot of things to be, concerned and depressed about. The world is very different than it was in the 50s and 60s. But then, between your 20s and 40s, there's this sort of curve that goes down. And it's not until maybe your 40s or 50s that you start to realize that you take into account your blessings and the things that you're good at. And there's this really difficult state. But anyways, my point is, during this time, one of the comments that Stephanie made, which immediately screamed, social influence, was that she mentioned that for example, Gen X had more grit, and that today's kids don't have any grit.
Mm.
And there was this interesting comparison between, this idea of like whether you had grit or didn't have grit, and there was like this interesting timeline of like where people stopped having grit, based on that conversation. And it strikes me as one of those interesting things that I think we are still suffering the consequences potentially of like people don't think of self-awareness, people don't think of like doing the things they like or they love, because there's this baggage of like, if you don't have grit, if you don't stick with your career, if you don't think, then you are potentially a failure, right? And I still see this today where like somebody starts a business, they'll like dig their heels in before they'll pivot and say, this is not working, I need to change something now. They don't want to lose face in the to their family or to their friends, and so I still feel like we have a lot of that baggage from this era of like, you have to have grit kind of thing. So anyways, that was interesting to me because I think you talked about the Industrial Revolution, some of the influence that had as a
Yeah.
backdrop, if you will, of the idea of having multiple careers.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, when you study some of the history around the evolution of work, there are many different consequences to the way that things have played out. So, the first one was around how we sort of adopted this factory mindset of work where people were given specialization as a primary directive that drives all of business. Like the way that we're going to grow businesses is we're going to have big lines of assembly where each person is going to have a very specific role. And so everything about the company is set up for you to have one role and for you to evolve in that role. Now, that is to say, specialists have a role, no pun intended, and there's a lot of value that can be extracted from specialists. But when we structure everything around that progression, then we prevent anyone from having freedom to move about and to explore different opportunities that might actually help them be more impactful.
Mm,
Another thing that sort of came out of that, which was I was kind of surprised to learn that this sort of concept around your identity being driven from work is not that old. Like it's actually a newer concept that was introduced more in the 80s. What started to happen was that people started to do fairly well at work. It was a somewhat prosperous time. And so essentially people would say like, well, what else is there? What more can I drive? And they needed to actually attach more meaning to work. And so that's when it started to kind of bring this idea that, oh, work can be meaningful. You could change the world through work, and it applied a whole new pressure to that. What it actually did was also present this dichotomy where if you're not working, then you basically have no identity. If you don't have this job, then who are you? You're nothing.
Right. You don't
You
have a
know,
lane. Yeah.
you don't have a label, you don't have a link, you've got nothing. And even the structures of society started to follow that. So for example, in America, this isn't the case everywhere, but for example, in America, if you're not working, you're not entitled to healthcare, in an affordable way. What signal does that send? It basically is like, well, I mean, you should be working. Well, no, I mean, there's more to me than work, right? It's like, no, not really. I mean, unless you're a productive member of society, I don't know what you're doing here. We certainly should be paying for you to be alive. But I think that if you follow these, what ends up happening is that people feel an extreme amount of pressure to be working and to participate in this way. And
Mm.
so anything that they do that threatens that, like you said, threatens that security, is very scary, and most people won't do it. The other sort of facet of it is that if you are, say, interested in experimenting and sort of stepping out of the box, theoretically, if I as your friend, I would ideally say, I support you. This is great. But it's not in my human nature to do that. It's in my human nature to defend myself and you from risks. And if I've been trained for the majority of my life to be convinced that experimentation outside of the box, stepping out of the lane is risky, then I'm going to go to you. What are you doing? Why are you doing that? So when you say, parents might ask or peers might ask, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? They're not evil. They're just sort of like afraid.
Defense mechanisms. Yeah.
It's a defense mechanism, right? And so we have this sort of like status regulation, which is something I talk about in the post. And society becomes the enforcers that keep us kind of going in this direction. And I mean, I would say I feel pretty happy with sort of the mix of different things that I'm doing. I have, but I still have a lot of peers who are like, cool, cool, this is great and all. So when are you when are you going back to build another startup? Like, because it's sort of this expectation that I'm just sort of messing around. And so I think we have a long way to go from a perception perspective to be able to accept and recognize that people need freedom. People are naturally not, meant to sort of sit in a box and stay in that. And yeah, we have a lot of work to do to kind of get there. But some of these conversations hopefully will help us
Yeah.
recognize and sort of normalize the sort of fluidity that we all need.
Yeah, it's interesting that even in my own role at Enable, I think one of the interesting things, the process of joining the company was sort of me coming to terms that I have this duality in life of like I have this IT business that I'm a part owner in, and that I also am applying for this job where the expectation of the job is that I'm going to dedicate X amount of hours to this job. And it's interesting to try and challenge that process to say, well, I don't think that that's actually the outcome of my work. The outcome of my work is the value I create. And so
Right.
one of the interesting sort of conversations to have, and I don't think many people think to challenge that because, the expectation is I'm trading 8 hours of my day for X amount of dollars. But in my mind, it's much more of a value creation strategy. And so if I can decide that if I can get an employer to think of what value they put to the things I'm doing or the outcomes that I'm creating, I think it sort of helps change that conversation. So it's maybe one of those things that the experiences in different careers has allowed me to question things of that nature. But your blog post, one of the reasons it sort of went viral was Toby from Shopify, retweeted it, and sort of it took it a life of its own from there. And that's, I think, how I came across it. But the thing he said about your article was that having range is undervalued and underrated. And I thought that was an interesting choice of word, because I think this is it's not necessarily polymathism necessarily, but I thought the choice of the word range was interesting, because it's the exposure to things that gives you some context. It's like people tell you, oh well, you can get perspective in life if you travel, and if you've never traveled,
Yep.
you are very one track minded, for example.
Yep.
And maybe that's an opinion, maybe it's a fact. I don't know, but this idea of range struck me as interesting, because it's not the same thing as a multifaceted, multi-career person necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, his perspective is also coming from how he sees Shopify and how he wants to sort of grow the engineering team there. I know that he's a big proponent of sort of more generalist sort of mentality engineers. And so that means people that, like, sure, yeah, you write code, but at the end of the day, your job is helping people, solving problems, building products. And so if there's a little design involved, you can do that. If there's a little bit of, working with the customer, you can do that. And I think the folks that are able to do that really do shine in that way. And I think that that is probably one of the things I've learned as I've continued to sort of still do individual contributor roles as an engineer. Um, I've kind of found this fun niche around engineering where yes, I'm writing code, but because I've been a CTO, I actually can go into any meeting and help with leadership and guidance and direction. And because I care a lot about drawing and artistry and design, I can actually just sort of do the design myself or really help and have a great conversation with the designer. And when you start to be the person that can reach over and sort of shake hands with different departments every time you work, you become the person that people want to work with, right? Because they
Yeah,
want someone that understands their perspective. So, all the people skills that you mentioned, as IT is sort of dealing with all these problems, those are
yeah,
immensely valuable. If you can actually understand and sort of have range in the type of conversations you're willing to have,
yeah.
honestly. I
Functional empathy, if you will. Yeah,
Functional empathy, that I think it's totally that, because like it's less about like I don't need to be a designer, right? I don't need to understand every tool and every detail around it. I need to be able to understand designers and the role of design and the importance of design, so that the way that I like to think about it is like usually I don't end up having disagreements or arguments with the designer I'm working with, because I end up having those arguments with myself before I even talk to them, because
yeah,
I can sit down and be like, okay, well, the feature is sort of being built this way. I'm pretty sure that, one of the things that they're talking about is around we're trying to, make this top bar more universal. We're trying to, and so I think in this case, is this going to assist that? Is this going to conflict with that? And you have that whole conversation, right? Before you even engage them. And then you can kind of be like, hey, I thought about it. Here are the several things, factors. I would recommend this, but what do you think? And they're like, yep. I mean, that to them is like a dream interaction, right? It kind of reminds me of you've probably seen this, but like the levels of helpfulness in a
yeah.
startup. I remember this article. I forget the
It's
name of it, unfortunately,
the
but
anticipation of needs. Yeah,
the
it's an
anticipation
interesting
of needs.
thing, because I think in IT you definitely have the people that just solve the one thing, and it's a boxed issue and boxed problem. I can't click this button. Okay, I fixed you not being able to click that button, and that's where the troubleshooting stops. But there's the other people, and I'd like to think I'm one of the other people, which is I also think of, okay, what is the next thing they're going to do? Might they have a problem there? And what is sort of the different forks in the road of that interaction? Um, to the point where it's always been one of my badges of honor that I can imagine the person clicking and doing all the actions from A to B, and be able to say, okay, well, the next thing is going to happen once you are able to click this button is this other thing is going to come up, and make sure you pick this or that, whatever. And
Yeah.
I find that those types of anticipations are the things that create the most sort of delight and wonder in end users. And it's so hard to do sometimes, because many times there is no next step, and you can't create that delight. It's a very, one uh, a point solved problem, that's it. And other times there are complex, workflows that you're solving for. So very interesting. I'm not sure if you're going to reference an article, you were thinking about it, but
Instead, I just want to touch on something, which is that, and I think it would be great if we jumped into some questions here. I'm curious how some of the audience is thinking about this, but um, I'm imagining someone in the audience listening to this, and I can, having had this problem myself, I just wanted to sort of proactively raise it. So one of the challenges is like, you want to be that person. Of course, you want to be that person that goes and solves all these problems, but the environment isn't well suited to that. So in my case, one of the things I've seen before is I would get feedback from peers like, hey, that was really helpful. I love working with you. You go the extra mile and stuff like that. And then I would go back and a manager would have a conversation with me and say, hey, it's clear that you're helpful around all these other things, but really you should be focusing on this, and you really should be doing more of, lines of code or whatever it might be. And at that time, it occurred to me that essentially there's like a trade-off that you have to make. You're choosing to help people expand your range, and these things will be helpful to people today, but also will be really helpful to you tomorrow. And sometimes it's at the expense of being recognized, for that. You're not always going to have people that are going to be like, oh, it's so great that you're so multifaceted. It's so great that you go an extra mile. Some people will view that and be like, you kind of have a problem where you get distracted and you kind of work on other stuff. Like, I think that's great and all, but you really should be focusing on this. So
mm,
that is a reality. We have to face that reality, is that not every environment, not every manager, not all the leadership are going to even recognize this. And so you kind of have to make a personal choice. And in your case, you've made this where I'd be like, no, I just really want to. It's driven by curiosity or a desire to help or whatever it might be. And I'm sure someday it will pay dividends. And I think that's part of why I'm here, is to let folks know like it will. But it may not today, and it may actually be seen as not the
yeah,
not the not the most important thing today. And you may get that feedback. And I understand that makes it hard. And so I just want everyone here to hear that. Like I know it is hard, but there is value down the line. When you look at the arc of someone like you, or you look at the arc of someone like the people that we're talking about, you see the returns much later.
yeah.
Yeah, I
So
just kind of wanted to call that out.
and I bet there's people on this presentation today that are quite literally on the fence of like, this is a super fluffy topic, and I don't, I kind of interested, but not really, because I'm just going to go grind it out. I have grit. I'm going to go get my job done. But they're curious about, maybe there's something missing. There's an interesting question from the audience, which is, how have you avoided people feeling like their toes are being stepped on when you have, let's call it functional expertise in an area? How are the designers not a bit miffed if you're being an armchair expert when that's not your current role? And I think this is maybe that defense mechanism you were talking about a little bit of like, it's perhaps society prevents people from being creative in other fields or other roles because people will feel like their reason for existing, which is their job, which is the thing that is wrong in the first place, is being threatened by the presence of some other person that supposedly has expertise in this area. And so, like, how do you not piss other people off?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Um, so the first thing I would say is it's important to recognize that everything we do, everything we say, our tone, our facial gestures is a signal, and people interpret that signal. So when you are working with someone whose toes you theoretically might step on, whether that's a peer designer, or whether that's a peer in sales, or whether that's a peer in some other field, um, it's important to first of all recognize that if they feel like their toes are being stepped on, it's because they perceive a threat. They perceive you as a threat in this case. So what I always try to do is, sort of ramp up the level of helpfulness. In fact, I'll go back to this level of helpfulness thing. So, when they talk about in a startup, when you join a startup, the first basic thing you can do is you can go to someone and say, like your manager or a peer, you can say, hey, I found this problem, and that's it. And then they're kind of like, okay, well, a second level is, hey, I found this problem. I think we could do this. And the third level is, hey, I found this problem. I think we could do this. Here's another option. I would recommend this. And then the fourth one is, hey, I found this problem. Here are some options. Here's what I would recommend. And I'd like your permission to go and do it. And then, the peak level of helpfulness is like, here's the problem. Here's some options. I think this was the best option. I went and did it. Right. And it's extremely helpful. But if you just met someone, you can't do the first level of helpfulness, the top level there. They would be like, well, you and I haven't interacted enough for you to have that level of trust from me to
You don't
go
have
and
my permission to help me.
you don't have that permission to help me. Exactly. So you kind of have to work your way up where at first you're asking a lot of questions. You're proceeding with, you're siding with them. So you'll see like my Slack messages, if you could observe them with these peers, you'll see they start off with, hey, I noticed this, and I noticed that your intent here was this. Is that true? Oh, interesting. And you're just sort of learning and learning and learning. And then maybe you ask one question about some switch to how they approach the design. And you ask, excuse me, to establish their intent. So you want to signal to them that your purpose here is you recognize their purpose. That's part of my job, is to recognize your job. I recognize it and I think it's valuable. And I'm here to help it because I think it's so valuable. So, in these conversations, by the end of it, they actually prefer my involvement because they know that I advocate more for the design goals that they're pushing for than they do in some cases. Because, as a designer, sometimes it's hard because you feel like an adversary. But if I'm an engineer, I'm in the engineer role and I can push. I can be like, no, we can't do that. There's a design goal here. And so you have to prove that trustworthiness over time. Now, you don't want to do this in an inauthentic way. I'm not just going to go and agree with everything. I really do push back on the things I don't agree with. But they have established that I'm here to help. And so you have to do the work to first convince them of that. And then you can start to say, okay, hey, man, you and I have talked about this a ton, and I know you really feel strongly about this. I'm going with this. Does that sound good? And sometimes it just stays there. Sometimes you never get past the point where you just go and proactively do stuff, and I think that's fine. I think in this kind of context, that's fine. But this is where all the people skills have to play. Like, you really need to be able to see what are they saying when I do this. So if everything you do is in a Slack message, it's going to be more difficult. So you want to have some of these conversations happen either in person or over video, so you can actually see how they feel when they're saying this. You can tell. You can tell when someone is like, I don't, okay, what is it? No, and versus like, oh yeah, oh thank God. Are you gonna take care of that? Oh, thank God, good. I don't have to worry about this anymore. Like, the minute you become a person that takes off a burden versus a person that's kind of coming in and trying to do their job, it's two very different people. Yeah.
So one of the things you talked about or mentioned in some of your other content, I don't know if you had talked about this in the Polymath playbook blog post, but there's the Steve Jobs parable of the stones. And I thought that was interesting because what I immediately, and for everybody's benefit, the parable of the stones is Steve Jobs tells this interesting story where he, as a kid, he went to his neighbor's house and the neighbor put some jagged rocks in a tumbler and then left the tumbler running overnight, said, come back the next day. And the next day they pulled the rocks out of the tumbler and they're smooth and polished rocks. And so he uses that as a metaphor to talk about teamwork and how it's great when teams can clash and they bump against each other, but at the end you have a polished result and the team gets better and stuff like this. And so I immediately I thought, hey, that's a fantastic, lovely metaphor for teamwork. However, one of the things that immediately hit me is like, well, how much individualism do people come at their jobs with? And are they truly capable of thinking of that, sort of getting on the bus and rowing in the same direction? Patrick Lencioni talks about this in Five Dysfunctions of a Team, that, even if you have a disagreement, there's a point where you can agree to disagree, but still get on the bus and row in the same direction. Otherwise, you're
Right,
just creating conflict unnecessarily.
right,
And it strikes me as a challenge, because sometimes people always seek like 100% consensus, and that's not necessarily healthy. If everybody
right.
always agrees on everything, you just can't necessarily, go in the right direction. Or if people are just being agreeable, then you don't have the right type of conflict, the right type of challenge. But my point of telling that story was simply to ask you about this sense of individualism, and that maybe the challenge that people have with feeling like their toes are being stepped on is that they've taken a very individual approach or individualistic approach to their role and their job, as opposed to, refocusing their energy on the outcome of the team, and whether
Right.
the feedback being given is in the interest of the outcome, and not necessarily feel like, people take things personally, obviously.
Exactly right. Exactly right. I mean, I think there's two takeaways here. One is that the work is possible. You can do the work of clashing against each other, but if you have shared intent and trust, the clashing can be positive and it can be magical. The other takeaway is that human nature is unpredictable. You can't ensure that someone is going to react correctly, quote unquote, right? Like, I think, in fact, that is one of the great fallacies of our lives, is that we try to control how others behave. And when they don't behave a certain way, then we get really upset. And the thing is, I read this book called Courage to be Disliked, and I actually wrote about it in a blog post called "Altering Your Reality." And one of the lessons, it's from based on lessons from a psychologist named Joseph Adler. And one of the things he talks about is this concept of separation of tasks. So, an example of this might be like, it's your job to decide whether you like me or not. It's not my job. I can't change that. There's literally nothing I can do. All I can do
Mm.
is operate and live. And the more I try to do your task of liking me or not, the more I'm going to get lost in it. And so when it comes to collaboration, it's kind of the same. Where like, you can do the best you can do the right things, send the right signals. You can even be really explicit and literally just pause and be like, hey man, I just want to be super clear, hey, I just want to be very explicit that I'm trying to establish this shared intent that I think we both have. Is this the case? And then they might be like, yes, or they might say, no, actually, I think we should have this other intent. And then you maybe have to resolve that. Because I think your point is valid, that like, a lot of times you're not even trying to hit the same goal, but you don't know that yet. So I highly encourage having the conversations to ensure you're hitting the same goal. But there's still going to be situations where people are going to feel maybe threatened no matter what. And that has a lot more to do with them. They may have a manager or an environment around them where it's kind of cutthroat and they feel threatened in every direction. And so even when you approach with caution, care, and empathy, they still perceive that as a threat. You can't win them all. And so
Yeah.
it's important to recognize that maybe if I looked at all the relationships I have at work, maybe some of them have prospered to the point of rock clashing, and others are not at that point. But my hope is usually that they observe what's happening over here, and they're like, hey, how come when they work together, they seem to just get a lot more done. They just seem to have really fun, breezy, playful conversations. They look like they're arguing, but they're not arguing. They're just sort of really passionate, both of them. And so you kind of want them to see that example. But you can't always expect that from every interaction. It's just humanity and sort of our nature, that not everyone is going to operate that way all the time. So we kind of also have to adjust our expectations accordingly.
So we're running up on time, but I have a couple last questions that I want to talk to you about. And it's this idea of like you talk about this, and I think one of your other blog posts, it might be The Art of Persuasion, but the illusion of individuality. And it's kind of it speaks to a little bit of what I was talking about a moment ago, is that I think people come into some of these things expecting that there's all this individuality that is part of what they do. And maybe there is, maybe there isn't, and maybe it's a construct of society. Maybe it's a construct of the job, because at the end of the day, meaningfulness and fulfillment, and I'm not sure if you've read The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek. It's something that's influencing a lot of my thoughts these days.
Hmm.
Is whether a company can reasonably balance, or the mixture of sort of the capitalist goals of a
Yeah.
shareholder driven company of profit and quarter after quarter results, versus sort of the idea of a long term objective of just being great and doing the right things. And so, like, where is that balance, and where do people fit into that? Hey, I can latch on to here and hold on to the rail, and take that wagon, for the rest of my career. Or is this, a finite type of thing? And so the thing that really started to become a question for me is, as people transition through different careers in their lives, there's maybe this sense that you're job hopping, or that you're switching contexts, and there needs, or I guess there must be, some kind of continuum that connects people through their different careers. And you could say it's their
Hmm.
personality, it's their this, it's their that. And I honestly feel like, I don't have a label. Like, people think of me maybe as a musician more so, depending on how they met me, or they think of me as an IT person, depending on whether they met me there. The last thing I would imagine somebody thinks of me now is a marketer, even though I have a marketing job role. My boss would laugh if I said, I'm a marketer. I'm the last thing, the furthest thing from it. But I want to ask you about this, like, the thread. Like, how do you think people should think about what connects them from an identity and individuality perspective across switching careers, and how to reconcile that, I guess, because to not lose, your sense of belonging, or not lose your sense of place in a society that's very lane driven.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'd say a couple of things. First is that I think our desire to know our story before it's finished is a source of great tension. So we want to know, where's my story going? What's the arc here? What's the moral of this story? And you're still alive, so hold on.
Yeah.
I like to think that this story emerges sort of as a tapestry over time. I try, and I think especially early in my career, I even got some advice on this around, like, make sure each decision you make in your career, adds to your story. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that's a good framework overall, but I think it also places a lot of burden, unnecessary burden, on having some sort of very well structured narrative and arc around every decision that you make. And it doesn't really lend itself to experimentation and trying things that don't necessarily work out but lead to something else. We can't really write those stories. Like, if you were like, well, and then this happened, and then surprisingly, actually, that turned out to be this. You can't predict that stuff. So I think it's important to embrace a level of serendipity. The second thing I would say is, yeah,
Mm,
there's two things in addition I would say. One of the things I learned, this is slightly tangential, but an important point here, is that not every company and not every team is well suited for your individuality to be manifested at work. And I've experienced this firsthand, where I've started to realize, like, okay, if you've got a team and there's like 1,000 engineers, and you're kind of coming in and you're being like, I want to do this and I want to do that and I want to do that, and it's like, that's great, Salman, but honestly, truly, what we really need is someone that's doing this. And I'm like, you know
mm,
what? That's fair. That's just fair. I respect that and I get that. And so maybe I need to find a different environment. Maybe it's an earlier stage company where sort of more individuality and differentiation is appreciated. But it's important to recognize it's not just about what we want. It's also about, like, fundamentally, what is going to be okay for a company and the role. And so that's the second thing I'd say. The third thing I would say is that, personally, when I think about this, let's say when my ego comes in, it's like, dude, your story is getting really confusing. What is it again? What do you do? What's going on there? And I'm like, Okay, let's relax here. The way that I try to think about it is there is liberation in being able to put on these different hats and take on these different identities. So, for example, there's certain people, I'm actually just a writer. They've only seen, my essays and my stories and my newsletter, and they think I'm a writer, and everything about me is driven around that. And I think that's great. There's certain other people that think, oh, he's a startup founder and an engineer, and everything about him is over here. There's certain people, that choose these other things. And I actually think it's kind of nice to be known as different people because we are actually of multitudes. We are not like
Mm,
one thing. We have these different parts of us. And the reason why I say it's nice for me is, so this happens all the time. You are taking on some path, and then you just get to a point where you feel frustrated, you feel demotivated, you feel depressed about, some job or whatever. It's nice to have a different mask to put on that day. You can be like, today, this thing is really bumming me out. But you know what? I can put this mask on and sort of play over here a little bit, right? And I use the term mask sort of more playfully because, a lot of times we have to put on these masks and pretend. But if you kind of take ownership of it and be like, I'm going to choose to jump in this way and jump in that way, it certainly takes more energy and coordination, and it's certainly less simple. So
yeah,
I'm never gonna have a nice solid answer to what are you doing.
right.
I've just accepted. I'm not gonna have a nice answer to that, and that's okay. And that's a really silly reason to live your life a certain way, is just to have a nice answer to a certain question.
Yeah, hold
But
on. Let me check my Facebook status, right?
yeah, exactly, right. And so I think I've started to embrace that, and I think people can embrace that. It's a really nice release, right? So when you
Mm,
first mentioned disconnect, what is it that people want? They want to just be like, look, yes, I want to keep doing this, but honestly, I just don't feel great about it right now. Can I just put a pause on it? Yes, you can. You can put a pause on that because that it does not define you. There's more to you, right? Just like you said, between your musician mode and your marketer mode and things like that. And I love that we get to choose who we are on what day, and we can answer questions based on that, because actually we are full of those, and not just in terms of work, but there are also versions of you. Like in my case, I'm Indian. I grew up in the Middle East actually. Then I lived in Canada. Then I moved to the U.S. And so some people will ask questions like, "Where's home for you?" And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I have many homes, and that's kind of a nice thing, right? I mean, you could look at it and say, oh, how sad, like you move all the time and that must be hard and stuff. I'm like, no, it's nice. I can go to Canada and that's home. I can go to India and that's home. I can. So it's really like a mindset shift of like, how do we make it like a thing that we can choose rather than like a thing that
right.
we have.
And it dawned on me as you were talking about, all the things that we label ourselves as, or that we are, so to speak, and we go out and say, I'm a musician, or I am a marketer, or I am an IT person. And it'd be interesting if we sort of put that in the tumbler, so to speak, and it came out as I am somebody who, like, instead of being a writer, you're somebody who inspires other people to think about something. So I'm an inspirationalist, or I'm
Right.
not a musician. I'm like an emotion creator, or like we thought of in terms of outcomes rather than the
Yep.
things that we are trying to label ourselves are. Because I wonder if we're
Totally.
creating more, like digging a deeper hole by trying to put labels on all these things. Because invariably LinkedIn profiles are going to be like I'm in this comma, this comma, this comma, this. Even my Twitter profile the other day, I was trying to edit it, and I was like, I can't fit so much shit in here. And I was sort of laughing at, like, what are the top 30 things that I am? And I felt like cheating myself, because, like, well, I'm
Yes.
still these other things, like, why, but I can't, the character limit, whatever. I thought it was just funny and ironic and hilarious. And so, but people wouldn't accept necessarily, or society wouldn't accept a outcome based definition of myself necessarily. I think it
Yeah.
would be, be outside of the norm.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I feel the same way sometimes. I never get to include all the things, and then I'm like, oh no, I'm not including all the things, and like this isn't properly representing me. I like your flip on it, which is, I try instead to be like, here's the stuff that I made, and you can choose who I am based on the stuff that you made. Basically, they'll resonate with something, and they'll be like, oh, okay, you're the person that creates this. So maybe it's writing where I'm, accessing my human experience, or there's some poetry, or whatever it is. So I really like that, because I think, I like associating with the things I make rather than just a label that has expectations of how I should be operating. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm a writer, but if I say writer, you're going to think I work for, a journalism publication, which is also great, but it's not what I do. And so it's kind of more what you were saying of like, I write because I want to inspire people. I want to talk about the creative struggle. I want to help people along, and write posts like this so that people kind of bring themselves to have these conversations. But they're all just mediums, right? We're all just trying to express ourselves and connect with others.
Mhm.
And it's more interesting to connect on the things than the labels. Um, and I've also, just the last thing I'll say on this is, sometimes, when you have that fear of like, oh, I haven't, in my case, it's like, oh, I didn't put startup founder and acquired something, something, something. And I thought about it, and I'm like, if there's somebody that needs that in order to connect with me, and that without that status or label, they would find none of the other stuff I do interesting. I'm probably don't have the space to connect with this person, and that's okay. You don't have to connect with everyone just based on labels. Like, if you see all this other stuff I'm doing and you're like, I don't have any interest in that, but if you had told me that you were a startup founder once, then we're talking. And I'm like, you know what? It's okay. I can't play that status upholding game. I need to connect with people based on these creative things, because that's sort of where I am in life. And so I kind of have to
Mm.
talk myself down and be like, it's fine, it's fine. I can't prove myself to everyone about everything all the time, and that's okay.
Man, we could probably go on for a while on this topic. I definitely am going to try and wrap it up to be respectful of your time. You probably have things to get on your day with as well. But I'd love to leave, I'll make the ask now. I'd love to leave this open to a follow-up conversation, because one of the things that happens when I have this type of engaged conversation is I start thinking about more things that I want to later debrief more on. And hopefully, you've experienced a little bit of the same, and maybe we can do a follow up. I know that you mentioned you were working on a follow up to your Polymath blog post, which is something that can be a little bit more, let's just say, tactical in nature. So,
Yeah,
how to actually apply, having this sort of interesting cross section of things that you do into like making it work for your
yeah.
role today. And so I'd love to maybe connect with you after that blog post and be able to debrief on that.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I definitely look forward to hearing as well of how folks, what sparks kind of came out from the conversation, because I think for some folks it's kind of like, this is an interesting idea, like, let me think about it, and they kind of think about how they might actually apply that, and then you quickly run into barriers. Like, that's the thing here, right? Like, it's a different way of living,
Yeah.
but it's not one that's just like magically easier and everything will fall into place. It's kind of an active choice to prioritize some internal tension around, feeling stuck, versus an external tension that you'll hit if you start exploring, right? That's kind of how I look at it, is this internal versus external trade-off. Um, so yeah, I'd love to continue the conversation and talk more about like how to apply it. I am trying to figure out like, what are the formats and sort of for guidance around this, because it is a very
Mm.
individual thing, right? Like, there's no, okay, everyone should just do this. There's kind of like, here's some principles, here's how you start applying them, and then here are typically the type of issues you run into. And
Mm.
I'm starting to abstract them, but part of the reason why I want to have more of these conversations is because I want to speak with more people who are trying to apply them and then are running into issues. So I would also say to anyone on the call, my DMs, as they were open for Louis, they are open in general. So feel free to DM me, or send an email follow up after this. I would love to hear thoughts, questions, because I really do want to elevate sort of this discourse, and sort of progress to points where people are trying to do this, and if there's ways I can help I'd love to, but I'm figuring it out as I go along. So a lot of times I learn from those conversations just as much as the other folks.
Yeah, I put your Twitter in the chat for everybody's benefit, and
Nice.
I'll definitely look forward to that. I think you mentioned something which is the thing that I've been focusing a lot of my latest thinking around, which is principles and the idea of first principles and the idea of like paring everything down enough that you can come look at something without all the preconceptions or societal constructs or things that maybe taint your view or the possibility for you to explore something. And so maybe that's the ticket. And I'd love to see how you end up sort of applying some mental model to how you create a framework for people to think about polymathism. It's like, it's a crazy thing to talk about, really.
Yeah, yeah. We'll
Yeah.
see how it turns out. And I appreciate the conversation, which is kind of pushing that forward. And this was a delight and lots of fun.
Awesome. Well, thanks to everybody. I appreciate everyone joining us today. We'll post the recording on our usual locations and send a follow up in case you want to sort of think about some of these things some more. And thanks, Solomon. I appreciate you spending the time today and hanging out. And you know, I am engaging with you on Twitter. I love your posts. I love sort of the range of your posts. Like one day it's a creativity thing, another day it's a polymath thing. And so I've loved sort of following you on Twitter and the social media channels in
Thank
general.
you.
So we'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.